this meeting of the committee, I mean, a certain amount of formality inevitably pertains in meetings of this kind, but we try to proceed in as informal and relaxed way as possible. Having said which, we are being broadcast, so don't be ruder about people and you're happy to go out on air. There will afterwards be a transcript which you can correct if something's been not come out as clearly as you like.
Sure.
You are, however, protected by parliamentary privilege, so if you're rude, you may cause a row, but
without being sued. Excellent.
Right. You have in front of you, I think, a list of the interests being declared by members of the committee. I don't know any that are relevant to this particular session.
Sure.
Okay. May I start us off by asking this? When you started with focus groups, Deborah, as I remember it, you were always very clear, these are not opinion polls, they're something separate but different. And when it comes to using social media to forecast elections, there are two possible views. One is this is a superior method to opinion polls, or the other is this is an alternative and supplementary measure which adds to understanding, but is not a substitute. Perhaps you should start with this one, Jean-Pierre. What's your view?
Thank you. My view certainly is that it's supplementary. I think social media gives a view of how the public feels about an issue which isn't captured by an opinion poll in the same way that an opinion poll captures a view about an issue which isn't captured by social media. So certainly I think the future lies in the combination of the two approaches. Social media gives the unsolicited views of people, which has value. It's not always, because you can't ask the question, you don't know what you're getting. And so the trick is in the listening. What are you listening to? But certainly it gives a view of where there's potentially something missing in an opinion poll, as we've seen in the elections gone by.
Did you want to add to that, Deborah?
Yes, I mean, I would agree. I certainly wouldn't describe it as superior, for sure. You know, I mean, one of the things that annoys me and has annoyed me over the years is that polling is used as a sort of catch-all, and there are lots of different sorts of methods, of which social media listening, which is how I would describe it, rather than is one. It's very useful, but you know, all social media is, and you know, it's a cliche, but it's true, it's a sort of echo chamber where it's a self-selecting group of people, and you know, you have a kind of a very defined audience. It's quite good, I think, at helping you to understand what a particular audience is thinking. But I think that it's not a substitute for nationally representative quantitative polling, which also should not be used on its own without qualitative research to kind of to really dig deep and understand what people, you know, what lies behind the data. You need to use them all.
Thank you.
If you want to know what's going on.
Rob, sorry.
Question. In our notes, in terms of background to BrandsEye, it says, and I quote, an important difference in the way BrandsEye operates is that its approach does not simply rely on algorithms, it goes further than just that. Now, one of the difficulties we've had as a committee is identifying what social media is and how it operates. But could you just identify how you draw up the algorithms, rather than leaping on to what you do going further than that, but for our benefit, take it back to the start and clarify what actual work you do?
For sure. So most of our business is corporate related, so I'll use that example.
Yep.
If we're dealing with a corporate, typically they have 100,000 people speaking a month about them as a brand. And if it's a news provider, a lot more than that. It could be millions of people speaking. And the challenge that they have is, how do you listen to the people who are speaking to you, who actually have opinions or have experiences which need to be resolved? So if that's a bank or a telecommunications company, they need to understand which of my customers are unhappy and how do we resolve the issues. Historically, that's been done with a call center, and I'm sure everybody here has had that experience of sitting for half an hour at your own cost speaking to somebody on the other end of the line. So social media. social media represents something of the evolution of that way of how do we resolve issues with one another. Not between individuals necessarily, but certainly between a company and its customers, or between a government and the people that the government serves. And social media allows organizations to listen very clearly to what they're saying. The challenge is making sense of what people are saying. If you have 100,000 people, you can't read that. You can't have any group or even a team of people who you employ to read through that. It's just not cost effective to do it. So the alternative then is to use an algorithm. But as we know with algorithms, they're trained on sets of data which may or may not be relevant to the new piece of data that's coming in. And typically, certainly in looking at language, algorithms are very bad at understanding humans. And in the case of a Brexit or somebody complaining at their telco, it's just not reliable. So the way in which we process data, and I'll use Brexit as an example, we had 500,000 people speaking on social media in the week before the referendum. We then take a statistically significant sample of that 500,000 conversation and put it through what we call the BrandsEye crowd, which is people who work on our platform. And if you think of the Uber model, that's how it works. They apply to work on our platform. As the demand for data from our customers increases, we let more people onto our platform. They get trained by the system, and once they pass the training set, they're then allowed to work on live data. And live data in this case is the Brexit referendum. When somebody then mentions something about Brexit and we select it based on a keyword basis, either they're speaking about Brexit, leave, remain, whatever the languages that people are using, we'll use keywords to find it. And then if an individual mention, so whether that's a Facebook post or a tweet or a comment on a blog somewhere, if that gets selected by the system as part of the sample, it then gets sent to multiple raters within our crowd. So these are people like anybody here or who work on our platform, and they earn money by competing with other people to verify what is the sentiment of the author. So if somebody says very simplistically, I'm going to vote Remain, easy to understand. If somebody says David Beckham's voting Remain, therefore I will too, probably a bit of sarcasm. And these people then compete with one another to try and understand what did the author mean. And an algorithm can't do that. And so we've kind of gamified the way in which data is verified by people. And because it's a crowdsourcing platform, we have these people around the world in many different languages. We can process vast amounts of data through humans. So we use AI. Our AI system learns from how our crowd processes data to better serve the crowd with relevant information. We never let that information go to the client. Whatever we send to the client or we use for the kinds of work we did on Brexit or the US elections, or for trying to understand churn for a multinational, that comes through people. And I think that's a critical thing which we need to understand with social media. If you're using algorithms to try and help you understand how people feel, you're probably getting the wrong answers. And that's actually why we did the Brexit work initially, is because we saw other social listening companies saying it looks like it's going to be a Remain vote based on sentiment on social media, and we were just curious to say, well, maybe it will, maybe it won't. Let's have a look and see.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, before I go to you, Honor, Jean-Pierre has described his methodology. I think it'd be helpful for the record in the future if you just describe the methodology of focus groups.
Of focus groups, yes. I mean, it's interesting the example you give, actually, because running a lot of focus groups, as I did through the EU referendum, my judgment would be that there's no substitute for simply listening to what people say. So in a focus group, you have 6 to 8 people in a room, a very highly trained moderator. You will design a series of exercises to kind of get beneath the skin of what they're saying, so that people will tend to offer you a very rational explanation for how they feel. We will try to sort of dig deeper to understand that using a series of so-called projective techniques and other things. And to that point specifically, one of the things I think that we discovered through that was that actually saying that David Beckham, people responding to David Beckham voting one way or another would not be a sarcastic response, but in fact a kind of, he is a bloke who's a bit more like me than Barack Obama or an economic expert, and actually maybe I'll take that seriously. But what I would say, and in the end, this isn't an either or, by the way. I mean, I think what Jean-Pierre does and what I do are very complementary techniques, probably. But I would say there's no substitute for sitting in a room with a bunch of people who've been carefully recruited to represent a particular demographic or set of attitudes and really understanding how they feel about things.
It's very helpful. Nora?
Yes, I thank you, Mr. Kloppers, for a very clear explanation. I did sort of wonder what it would reveal about Rocket Man and Mad Dotard. But that's in brackets. My question is actually, Ms. Mattison, in your first answer, you talked about focus groups having defined audience. Who does the defining?
I mean, whoever is commissioning the focus groups. So my practice, like yours, is mainly a corporate practice.
So it just means selected audience, does it?
Yes, we do the selecting, not the audience. And actually that's quite an important point and it's distinctive from social media where the audience themselves have put themselves forward. We will go out and find people, so we will decide with our client, whoever the client is, that we want to speak to people that have a particular demographic, who have particular behaviours, have bought particular products, live in certain places, have a particular set of attitudes, and we will go out and find those people and recruit to that specification.
Thank you very much.
Catherine?
Start with Jean-Pierre, because I was interested about, you were talking about the referendum in particular, which of course is one issue, and I was wondering to what extent you felt with the social media, watching on social media, it guided you to people's views on an issue, but it was much more difficult to take from that a view on what party they were following. And from that, do you think that following, for example, another election, watching social media and listening, what it does is it guides you towards what people are feeling about policies, and in a more fluid sort of political environment, therefore, is an interesting additional tool to where people are going who maybe are less identified with a party.
So I'll answer that in a roundabout way. We describe the questions our crowd answers.
Yes.
So the first question is it relevant to the issue at hand? So if we're talking about Rocket Man, is that talking about, you know, the ruler of North Korea, or is it talking about the movie? So being able to separate out those two things is important, and for different brands, that's a varying complexity of issue. If you Sky, that's a hard thing to try and sift out everybody talking about Sky on social media, because it could be anything. If it's Brexit, much easier, because people only speak about Brexit with respect to Brexit. The second question is the sentiment one. What's the sentiment towards the object that we're measuring? The third question we ask our crowd is what's driving sentiment? And that's actually where it becomes very powerful, because you then start to see, is this a policy issue? And for our corporate customers, Uber's a good example, we can quantify, are people worried about price? Is it safety? Is it regulation? What are the issues that they care about when they're speaking emotively about a subject? And so being able to rapidly categorize that at scale gives organizations the insight into not only what is the issue now, but how does that issue evolve over time, and how does it compare across a competitive set or across parties or across regions. And so being able to take the whole conversation on social media, which is sometimes millions of people, and structure it, and then look at it from either geographical or region, a region or an issue, or across party lines or across customer or corporate lines, means you start to see how issues evolve over time. And it comes back to, I think, what Deborah is saying, is that ability to listen clearly, but then listen over time and see how does this evolve, how does it change, and it gives you the signals within that to say, this is something we need to drill deeper into because we don't understand it. And I think that's where the focus group then is powerful to help focus that conversation. Say, we don't understand what's happening with this particular issue, let's try and understand that deeper, which you can't do on social media unless people are already giving you that conversation to listen to.
Thank you.
Both described your methodologies as being a matter of listening, but I would just like to ask, if I may, about another kind of situation in which we're not talking necessarily about people's unsolicited views, we're talking about people's prompted views, where opinion is being deliberately manipulated through social media. People are being fed suggestions, people are being steered in their emotional responses, orientated towards a disposition to vote for a particular outcome, a particular individual, a particular party. And I think many people are extremely worried about this phenomenon that's arisen in politics with the rise of social media. So perhaps you would talk about that?
Yeah, I think those concerns are valid. To me, social media, the analogy is it's like a knife. You can use it to serve a meal or to kill somebody. And I think that power of social media, the answer to abuse is not no use, it's correct use. And so finding out what is the correct use and bringing in whatever, whether it's regulation or whether it's kind of penalties for organizations that abuse that, I think that's right. Because you can use it to manipulate people, you can use it to target individuals, and we have to be very careful as an organization to never get involved in anything like that. I think our sort of mantra as a company is how people feel matters, and if you can correctly understand how they feel, you'll better serve them with messaging, but also with products and services. Whether you're a government or a corporate, that rings true. I think where companies have manipulated it, the effects are very short-lived. You know, if you are, and it's the same, if your wife is angry because you're playing golf every weekend and you tell her you're not going to play golf and you're going to play golf, she's going to get more angry, not less angry, even though you promised her you would. Stop. And whether that's a political party, it's the same kind of thing that we see happen on social media, where companies don't listen first and rather use it to manipulate or to promise or to overpromise. That is a very short-lived cycle, and very quickly those people leave. And so it would be interesting to see within the UK public, how do people feel now about Brexit? How has that evolved over the past year? I don't know.
You raised the question of regulation, which it's quite hard to conceive how that might be achieved. Will you talk about some of the relevant issues?
Look, it's not my area of expertise. I think it falls into that category of how do we ensure that those who are both responsible for the platforms and who are using the platforms behave in a manner that's responsible. And so that means if somebody is peddling fake news, how do you call them to account on that? And I think that's a combination of both the platform taking some responsibility, which means prices will go up, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because it means the people who are then paying for adverts are thinking twice before they place adverts. I think that pay-to-play is very low at the moment, at pay point. So I think there is a role to play, but that's not our place to say how and how that should happen. I think the networks need to bear cognizance of, if they can sit in the middle of public opinion and corporates and close that loop in an effective manner, everybody wins. If the public know that they're coming onto social media, they're expressing a view, and the right person's hearing that view and doing something about it, means more people will go to social media to express their views. That's good for the platform, and it's good for the corporate, and it's good for the individual that's having their problem solved. Where there's a breakdown in that feedback loop through either mistrust growing, which is what we're seeing, corporates are trusting, or governments are trusting social media less, therefore they spend less money, therefore the platforms need to put more adverts on, which puts less people on the platform, the cycle breaks down. So I think building trust is where the regulation needs to play a role between the public and the organizations that are paying for things to happen on the social networks.
Regulation to be in use would need to be international.
Exactly.
Would it not? And there would always be weak links, rather as with the tax regime.
So, could you repeat the question?
Well, I don't think you can have regulation in one country, to coin the phrase, can you? You would have to have an international, consistent set of regulations which should be uniformly applied and enforced. And it's hard to foresee that coming into place, because there will always be powerful motives to abuse social media in order to manipulate opinion in the way I suggested, and there will be jurisdictions, shall we say, where the regulation is non-existent or patchy or deliberately left vacant.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. So I don't personally think that the answer is regulation. I think it can play a role. I think the answer lies in closing that feedback loop. I think if the networks realize that it's within their interest to make sure that the people placing adverts or deriving intelligence from the networks, in whatever way it is, if it's in their interest to make sure that they respect the voice of the user, which is at the very core of why Twitter, for example, exists, everybody wins. And so I think that's where government has a role to play. How do we make sure that the corporates are getting the value that they need out of the networks, and the networks aren't being steered towards ill-gotten gains in how they derive their income?
Margaret.
Well, my concerns really follow those of Alan Howarth. I think there is a difference, if I may say so, between what you've described as closing the loop, in which you're using the examples very much from the corporate sector, and the concerns which, needless to say, we Roundtable are particularly worried about, which are the deliberate influences of other national players in the sort of opinion manipulation that we're talking about. I mean, when you're talking about the malintention of international governments, that seems to me something which it's very difficult to actually to intervene in any particular way, because the bottom line issue, which you've talked about very well, doesn't apply. And I think when we look, as we did even yesterday, at the potential that was expressed by people who had left Facebook for the way in which they had deliberately sought to influence opinion at the behest of one of the campaigns, President Trump's campaign in the presidential election last year, that's susceptible to very different judgments and very different ways of thinking about it than the ones about the disturbance of the corporate network loop or the profit and loss account.
So there I think that you just need to be one step ahead. You know, it's the art of war is understanding better than anybody else what are the driving factors. And so where foreign governments are manipulating how people feel or manipulating opinion, I think what the US missed, and we're not involved in that, so I don't know, who was involved or how that worked.
No, I'm not suggesting at all, but I'm suggesting that your model is much more applicable and therefore much more relevant exclusively to a corporate world than a political one.
I think in the US example, and we actually tried to get to both the polling companies and to the political parties beforehand to say you're missing something on social media. And what was being missed was the mistrust towards Clinton that was being expressed on social media. And so whether or not, I don't think fake news produced that emotion. That existed already. I think it accelerated it, and I think it gave license to it, and it probably allowed it to spiral into something much bigger. But what it was triggering was a true underlying emotion. People mistrusted the establishment. And that it would be foolish to say that the reason she lost was because a foreign government meddled. I think the reason she lost is she didn't listen. I think had she heard clearly how did people feel about that issue, it could have changed the way in which the engagement happened. And that's the part for me that was missing. I think the foreign governments, whether they played a role or not, and that's going to continue to operate as you rightly said. I think the role of the people in this room is to say, how do we listen clearly to understand what do people care about, and are they listening to, as the saying goes, the small lies as opposed to the complex truths, which are harder to understand.
I mean, obviously we can't replay the minutiae of the American election last year or indeed the referendum campaign, but I do think it's important to emphasise that, albeit that I agree with you about some of those points you've made about the political issues, but effectively the point about the American election was that there was targeting at a very precise level by exactly the sort of organisations you're describing of people in specific areas which affected the electoral college vote. I mean, if we want to just reflect on it for a minute, Mrs. Clinton won the popular vote, but because of the targeting by precisely the people you're describing, it wasn't correct and it wasn't effective in terms of swinging the electoral college vote, where a minutiae campaign, a very directed campaign by social media was effective. Now that's a different thing from the opinion question you've raised.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the point remains that even when we track social media, the opinions shared at the battleground state level, we could still see on a representative sample which way the vote was going to go. Right. So whether or not the targeting happened, the social media got it right when mined correctly at a state level. Because we weren't looking at the popular vote. We knew we had to get the college map right. And there again, it was appealing to an underlying emotion which still existed. It was being manipulated and false promises were made, but that emotion was still there.
Yeah, it's the manipulation I'm focusing on.
Quite. Nora.
Mr. Kloppers, you used the phrase responsibility of platforms, and I wonder if you could sort of unpack that for us a bit. I think we understand very well how a publisher can be responsible because the law of defamation applies. And even if the author is anonymous, the publisher will be subject to that legislation. But how can a platform be responsible for content that people post, particularly if they take advantage of the cloak of anonymity? And if so, can self-regulation of platforms and platform providers work?
Whether it can work or not, I don't know. Whether it should work, I think it should.
Oh, I accept the should.
Yeah. And I think it's, if I use the Twitter example, they're in a difficult place right now as an organization. Fundamentally, why they exist is they represent the voice of the people. And so through us, we've lost clients because Twitter has said you may not serve that kind of client, because they believe fundamentally that we need to protect the voice of the individual. I think that's half of the story. You can only protect someone's voice if that voice is heard.
But if that voice can be multiplied n,000 times, what weight are we to give to any voice that is heard?
If the individual can say something that can be heard by thousands of people.
It may be the individual who originally uttered the tweet or whatever one does, but its multiplication is ultimately due to the use of algorithms, bots, and so on.
No, I don't think that's quite right. I think the multiplication, if it's paid for, can be because somebody's paying for it. I don't think the algorithm necessarily determines who hears it. So I think
no, not necessarily. But do you think that transparency about the payments would reveal something that is useful for?
Possibly, and maybe that's where some of the answer lies. That's again not within our realm to answer. I think it's short-sighted for the networks not to be transparent about that because of what we were talking about earlier. If they're going to build this virtuous cycle of connecting how somebody feels with people who can make a difference about it, then that transparency will help that, and that's good for everyone.
If that were their motivation.
Robert, can I ask related but slightly different questions to the two of you? Telephone canvassing, the people who respond has gone down and down, and therefore you'll hear stories about people who answer being called any number of times because they actually answer because other people have stopped.
They have a landline.
The same applies in terms of online. In the people who participate, there is the risk that they answer repetitiously, and they are more conscious of the political world than the ordinary population, which you're trying to get at. Can I just ask, Deborah, in relation to your field, you said you went out and got people. Do you find it as easy now as you did previously to find people, or are you in the same danger of the telephone and online people of actually finishing up with the same people in the focus groups? And the related question to Mr. Kloppers is, in terms of participation, obviously as people are getting older and more used to computers, then the participation goes up the age demographic, but we hear stories about people not participating, coming off Facebook, coming off whatever. Is there a tendency that actually that the groups you're listening to are in effect the same people over and over again, rather than getting a renewed message?
Deborah,
I mean, yes, you're right about polling, and if you want a reliable sample, then face-to-face random sampling is the only way to do it. The problem is it's very slow and very expensive, which is why it isn't done very often, and it isn't done usually in election campaigns and by newspapers and so on. In terms of how we recruit for focus groups, I think it's actually always been an issue that, so we use recruiters in different locations. Very often they will keep a large database, and we abide by the Market Research Society rules, which say that, somebody shouldn't have been a respondent, within a period of time, and we would add to that they shouldn't have been a respondent on a particular theme within a larger amount of time. I find that's not enough, and that there is a risk with, unless you're doing something quite precise, I'll come back to that in a minute, there's a risk that you get repeat respondents. So what we do as a company is keep our own database, and when focus groups have been recruited, we then check if we have ever seen that particular respondent before, and if we have, we just don't use them. So we do our best to, we do as much as we can. Obviously, though, often what we're doing is something that's much more precise. So it would be inconceivable, really, that somebody would have in a focus group would have done something. So we might be doing something where, I don't know, something for NHS England, where we're looking at somebody that has had a particular condition, or so we're recruiting fresh every time, and we're using our own networks to find people, usually face-to-face street recruitment or whatever, that that fulfill the criteria. So it's not so much an issue, it's much smaller numbers.
Does that apply in the political world as well?
The earlier point applies, I think, because usually with political focus groups, you're looking for people that have, it's been a particular kind of voting pattern or whatever. And so that's quite a large group. So very often a recruiter in a particular area might be using a database, so we would then come back to our own method, which is when the people have been recruited, we then check their details to make sure that we haven't seen them before and that they've not been multiple, that they're not sort of professional respondents.
Thank you.
It must be very hard to find people who are in full-time employment to participate in that type of focused research. With the time, that they wouldn't have time to do it, or when they're carrying out the research.
Focus groups usually take part in the evening, so it's not a problem, and we pay people.
Have you found that the recent political polling, which has been fairly inaccurate, has had an effect on your corporate customers who are beginning to doubt the accuracy of the polling which they're paying for when they see the outcome of the polling which is done on politics?
Personally, we don't do that kind of polling, so no is the answer.
It's just a general thing. So that I mean, because the only way a poll is really tested is when it's at an election time. It's very hard to test the polling which a corporate wants about a brand or a product or a focus. But because there's actually an outcome on polling with an election, and it's been so inaccurate. Has there been any sort of wobble on the corporate side to think, why are we paying, is there any need for this?
Well, I don't think so, but I mean, obviously, I think there's also a bit of myth. I mean, for instance, people talk a lot about the polls being wrong in the referendum. They actually weren't. They were broadly right in the referendum. More polls predicted Leave than Remain. They did. They did, trust me. And the polls was within a margin of error, pretty much spot on. So I refute that. I mean, yes, the polls were wrong in the last election, and I think there's been a lot of soul searching about why that is. And I don't know if you want to go into that now, but they were. But I think that, well, for my practice, it hasn't made a difference because that's not really the kind of work that I do.
Right. I want to add to that, Jean-Pierre, before I call Alan.
Well, I think you asked a question earlier around how do we ensure that it's a new group of people if we want that. I think one of the benefits of social media is you're listening to everybody that's volunteering an opinion. And provided the subject matter is soliciting enough opinions, you know, in the US elections it was 40 million conversations from 4 million people. So it's a vast number of people that you're actually sampling. And I think what we saw in Brexit and the US elections is almost a coming of age of social media, where before it was perceived to be the fringes that were talking, but it actually ended up anecdotally being quite representative of what the population felt about it. And I think because you're listening to everybody, you can then choose how you listen. How many times do you count somebody's opinion, so you can start measuring things like intensity, which polls struggle with. Okay. Volume of conversation from individuals versus just counting someone's opinion once. And then when you ongoingly listen, you can then answer the question, is it the same people talking, or is it new people talking? And we did that, you know, 2 months post the US election to try and see what was happening to Trump's support base after he took office. And a lot of those people just went quiet, you know, who had been talking before and then weren't coming out to volunteer their opinions anymore. And so we saw the wane in his support base long before Nate Silver was reporting it in the US, and, you know, the aggregation of polls. We saw that in February, long before you know, what we've seen happen over the past 6 months happened. His supporters went quiet a long time ago.
Oh.
I'd like to ask Deborah, if I may, how, in carrying out qualitative opinion research, such as focus groups, given that you're not gathering statistical data, you achieve rigor, precision, exactitude, draw reliable conclusions?
Well, you don't achieve rigor, precision and exactitude. It's not an exact science, I think, is the first thing. But I think that we do provide useful findings, and we do that by by the experience. I mean, it really all lies in the experience of the person who's conducting the focus group, and the methods that you use and how tried and tested they are. But it isn't an exact science.
Can I ask,
and you wouldn't use it on its own, by the way. You would use it alongside numbers anyway.
And if I can ask Jean-Pierre, is it your view that with the arrival on the scene on a very big scale of social media, this is tending to re-engage young people with political processes? I mean, we've had, certainly in this country, a considerable worry about the tendency of young people not to vote. We saw the last election, a great increase in participation by young people. Is that connected, do you think, to social media kindling a re-engagement?
I think social media, whether it's causing young people to vote, I don't know, because we don't know who on social media actually went and voted.
Yeah.
So we won't be able to tell that. I think what it has done is democratized opinions. You know, it gives everybody a voice, and you can very easily find people who feel the same way as you, which is both good and dangerous. So I'm not sure if it's getting more young people out to vote. It's certainly getting lots of people to talk, which is for me a good starting point, because then you have something to listen to.
Deborah, could I just ask a question on, you said it was not an exact science. At the time when you were doing focus groups with Philip for Tony Blair, the critics quite often said, well, they always come up with what Tony wanted to hear. And there are ways within focus groups where you can influence opinion in a way you can't with opinion polls. Opinion polls, somebody reads out a question, but you've got a moderator in the room who can look encouraging at some replies and less encouraging at others. So what would your answer to the critics who said you were only coming out with what Tony wanted? What would your answer to that be?
Well, I certainly never did that, and I think that you're not worth having, whether you're dealing with corporate clients or politicians, unless you're prepared to speak the truth. There is simply no point. But clients, be they politicians or companies, receive data from market research in different ways. So there are some that ignore it completely. There are some that use it to verify what they already thought, and there are some that use it genuinely to get an insight into a particular audience and then, think about their program in that light. And I've worked with all three politicians in my time.
Yes. We won't ask you to name names, Margaret.
I'm not sure that I'm not simply confused, but I wonder if you could help me on this. Deborah, you've said that face-to-face, face-to-face randomised sampling is the only way you really get something accurate. And we've heard from other people who've come and given evidence that, in a sense, if one could revert 25, 30 years to a system in which you said it was very expensive, but you were doing that.
And time-consuming.
And time-consuming, so you wouldn't meet the media deadlines, or at least certainly not social media ones. And then you have said, Jean-Pierre, that the thing that really works is this vast pool of people that you've described. You've just described it again in relation to the United States. I mean, what is the truth? I mean, is it really that there's nothing in between that works? Or is it simply that we are moving from the old-fashioned position, which was accurate, through a lot of systems which haven't been particularly, to another completely different one, which is going to produce accuracy on a different scale, but in a totally different way?
One for you.
Yeah, there's one for you, actually.
It's yours, Jean-Pierre, I'm afraid.
I think technology is there to help us. The world has changed in how people consume information, how opinions are formed, and I think the tools that we use to measure that need to evolve as well. So to me, that's not a bad thing. It's a reality of how the world works, how people consume information, how opinions are formed, and so the ways in which we listen to that need to evolve with it.
But human beings haven't really changed, or they may have changed in their attitudes, but are you really saying that actually the technology enables you to achieve something which, as Deborah has said and others have said many times, is only really achieved by face-to-face communication?
No, humans haven't changed. I think the way in which people communicate has. And that's been both good and bad. It's created the echo chambers, which we've spoken about. And so having the tools to peer into those, to see what is actually happening, to me puts great power in the hands of the people in this room to understand what do people care about. How do we better serve them in a way that maybe they wouldn't respond to in a focus group or in an opinion poll. I don't know. That is, like you say, it's very expensive to do that comprehensively. And there's no state-by-state poll in the US which is able to do it, just because of the costs. So I think that's where social media gives a lens into somebody's world, which 20 years ago you just simply wouldn't have had.
Yeah.
And a beneficial lens, your judgment would be?
Well, I think Deborah made a really good point around the prime ministers that she's worked with. I think those leaders who are courageous and who say, irrespective of how people feel, I want to hear the truth, I think it's helpful. I think if people are trying to reinforce opinions or positions that they've held for a long time, it's not helpful. Because this is the truth of how people feel, whether you like it or not. And so I think for those courageous leaders that are wanting to address the concerns of the public, it's helpful.
Catherine.
Yes, I just wanted Deborah to go back to your focus groups, because a number of my colleagues have touched on this already, but if it is true, and that's an if, that our electorate have become more volatile politically, and how then, when you're putting together a focus group which is supposedly politically, across a spread, do you know that they are anymore? And is that something sort of work in progress that you're looking at, given that there was quite a fluidity in 2017 and a bit in 15?
So I should say a little bit more about how focus groups work. So you would never have a spread of opinion in a focus group.
Right.
Focus groups work best when you have a very as homogenous a group as possible. So what I would do is decide the kinds of people, the particular opinions I wanted represented in that session, and then recruit to that, so that you have people who are as like each other as you can possibly get them. So you never have the spread in any case.
Okay, and just to follow...
Doesn't quite answer your question about volatility.
No, it doesn't quite, because you're still building but it is an interesting point, thank you. I just wanted also to ask you about the point about expenses, because it's come across in quite a lot of the written evidence we've had, the point about a more expensive type of polling versus less, and the accuracy that comes with that. And I wondered, are we seeing more polling, especially from commissioned by newspapers, especially in the run-up to election, when they're like thinking about the Sunday splash and let's have another poll, and it's, you know, slightly sort of fast, and is there something in that we need to watch? And would it be better if there were fewer polls and done with more time and accuracy?
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, because of the experience of the last election particularly, I think that there probably will be, there already are fewer polls actually, because I think quite a lot of newspapers sort of feel they have their fingers burnt a bit, and are looking at other ways of tapping into what public opinion is. But it's not going to stop, and you're right. I mean, I think that there are some issues there, because they are never ever going to be able to afford to do the kind of polling that is really reliable, and it doesn't match their deadlines either.
Yes, thank you.
And I would even add social media, using social media to infer a poll. We're not a polling company, but even that for newspapers is too expensive. We don't have any clients currently using our data for polling. You know, the people who are trying to track public opinion on an election are hedge funds. You know, it's not the newspapers. And I think those budgets are very small, which aggravates the problem, because then you're spending very little and the results are...
So basically,
you get what you pay for.
That sort of information that is being bought by sort of extremely well-off people or companies or hedge funds, for example, not, which is in itself an interesting point. Thank you.
Yeah.
Could I just follow up on that, and then Lord Howarth and Hayward, and then we'll wrap up. The question I wanted to ask following from that is, the opinion polls haven't got it right in last two British general elections. Does the kind of techniques that you're using give you any clues as to why the polls might be finding it more difficult, or are they completely separate?
Is that for me? I mean, I think... I mean, I'm sure you've had this from other people who've given evidence. There'll be other people who'd be better placed than me to comment on why the polls were wrong. But one observation that I have from my own focus groups was that, you know, historically one of the best predictors of whether or not somebody was going to vote was whether or not they'd voted in the past. And so actually in the last election, where I was doing political work, which I did with a newspaper group, we screened out people that hadn't previously voted, as did a lot of the polls, and that I think was the single biggest error. Now the problem is what you do in the future, because there is nothing particularly that says to me that those young people that voted this time will definitely vote again. We don't know that they'll vote again. You might think now they're on the electoral register they will, but equally they might think, well, I voted and it made no difference, I'm not going to vote again. So that's the problem. And certainly I think with focus groups, when I was doing focus groups with young people, we didn't get our sampling quite right, and that's definitely what happened with the polling as well.
Did you pick up...
Very quickly, that was true of the referendum, wasn't it? The fact that people voted who hadn't voted in general elections.
Yes, in a different way, because this time it wasn't young people.
No, I know.
But yes, it was. Yeah. It was absolutely right, yeah.
Did you pick up what turned out to be the huge surge in interest among younger people? Did that come through any of your focus group work, or indeed, if you compare any of the social media work?
I will have come through the social media work more clearly, I would think. I mean, for the reasons I've just said, what we tended to do is to not be listening quite to the right people, just as by the way, you know, people doing canvassing weren't, which is why the, you know, people in constituencies were reading it wrongly as well, because very often they weren't knocking on the doors of the people who, you know, who actually were going to turn out to vote, as it transpired. So.
Right, thank you.
So a couple of questions. I think on the age one, networks they don't share any age demographics with us, so it's actually very hard for us to get where the younger people speaking. So that as an aside, I think the two things that I would add to what Deborah said on differences we saw in the polling. The one was the unsolicited nature of social media gives you a read on the raw emotion of people, because they're coming out. And so there's no question bias, And particularly in the US, that played a big factor. It wasn't a question of, are you going to vote for Trump or Clinton? It was, who are you not going to vote for? That's not a question that was being asked. But we could read that negative sentiment played a very big role in the US elections. And I think the other thing we saw in both was the speed of social media typically for us led by at least 2 weeks what happened in the polls. And so a lot happened in the week or two running up to both the election and the referendum, which the polls didn't have the time to capture, but social media, you get it in real time, and so we could see that. So I think that kind of speed and raw emotion would be two elements which can really help polls in the future by adding what social media shows.
Very interesting.
I'd like to ask you if you'll indulge in a little bit of futurology. Deborah suggested that if people, whether it's political parties or newspapers or whoever, want to understand the reality of political opinion, you need the mix. You need quantitative opinion research, you need qualitative research, and you need to listen to the chatter on social media. I wonder if you have either of you any views as to how that mix may change and develop, what methods are going to be likely to be used by political parties in particular, given the experience we've had, given the emerging technologies and facilities that there are, whether indeed there'll be some new element added to the mix that we haven't talked about.
So, I mean, I think in a way I'm seeing a return to some quite old-fashioned techniques that are working very well. So we've just done a really interesting piece of work where we had people keeping diaries, literally keeping old-fashioned diaries, and it worked incredibly well and was very revealing. Ethnography as well, where you're observing what people do and not just relying on what they tell you they've done. And that can work very well, and you can do a thing, we call it mobile ethnography, where people are using their phones to sort of capture their daily routines and things that they're doing, which is very effective. So I think there's some interesting things. Also, the other thing, which is a little bit akin to you, but we use online communities quite a lot as well, where you will have people in an online community and communicate with them on an ongoing basis, so that you can track data and track behaviour change.
Yeah, I think all I'd add to that is, I think in the future, the tool set has changed. There's some old tools, like you've described, which are still in the toolbox and are very useful, but there are a whole lot of new ones that have been added, and I think the researchers in the future need to see research as a funnel of how do we deploy the most cost-effective mechanisms at the start, and then use the more specialized tool further down to drill into discrepancies. And I'd use Uber here as an example. Opinion polls say more people are in favor of the ban than against it. Social media says the opposite. So to me, that flags something. I was like, hang on, which is right? Which is where a more specialized tool set of let's get these people in a room and really understand this issue so that we come out with the right decision I think will be powerful.
Yeah.
Just, Deborah, Alan asked you to look to the future. I'm going to ask you to look to the past. Given your background in terms of working with two prime ministers, much has been made about the polls being misused or abused by the media. Do you feel that the media actually follows the guidelines that they have in relation to the use and abuse of the polls that they're given? And do you think you, and I don't mean you personally, but people in positions of power are actually able to influence the way the polls are portrayed in the media?
I mean, politicians I've worked with have paid a lot more attention to their own private polling, I think, than to published polling anyway.
Right.
So published polling is there for editorial purposes rather than, so it's there to generate a story, and that's what its aim is. So they will be looking for a sensational angle or a big headline or whatever. I think politicians are using polling in an entirely different way. And the only concerns that they would have about published data would be, I suppose, what their own team think when they're seeing things, and they will then find ways of circumventing that. As to whether or not and how historically newspapers have, abided by the regulation that they, so far as I'm aware, but I'm really not an expert, and I don't know.
Thank you.
Well, I think we've reached the end of a very fruitful, just over an hour. And I'd like to thank you both for being so interesting and forthright with the committee. It'll go in the mincing machine with the rest of the stuff now, but thank you both for giving up your time to be here. It's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you.
Okay.